question about suffering is probably the hardest question for Christians to deal with. And also, I would suggest it's probably the most common question because while some questions are relevant to a particular cultural moment or a particular point in history, obviously the reality of suffering is one that has existed throughout time and in all cultures. So how would we respond to it? Well, there's no simple answer. But then I'd also say, depending on your worldview, there are no simple answers. And one of the things actually I find compelling about the Christian faith is not that it has a simple, easy answer in response to suffering, but I do think it makes more sense than the way that other worldviews and beliefs try and make sense of suffering. And ultimately, the reality is all of us have to make sense of it somehow, whether or not I believe in God, whether or not I'm religious. We all live in a suffering world. We will all experience suffering. How are we going to make sense of it? Not just in theory when we're sitting in a lecture room, but in practice when it's happening to us. And one of the inadequacies that I've found with the atheistic or the naturalistic worldview is that ultimately it struggles to account for why suffering even is a bad thing in the first place. If the only story of reality that's worth believing is that I am the end result of an accidental process where the only reason for my existence is the need to survive, then why is suffering such a bad thing? I mean, things just exist. Death and decay have always been part of reality. This is just the way the world is. So the sense of talking about the problem of suffering doesn't really make sense within the atheistic worldview. It's not a problem, it's just a thing, like everything else is a thing. We can't really give it a moral judgment. And then, of course, there are other religious worldviews, and often religions have grown out of this desire to try and grapple with the problem of suffering. That was certainly the case for Buddhism. But Buddhism would say the way to deal with suffering is to basically recognize that suffering comes from our desire and we need to suppress that desire. And if we can suppress our desire, then obviously suffering will no longer be a problem. But actually, I wouldn't suggest it was a bad thing for us to desire a world that is good. In fact, as a Christian, I would say that is a good thing. It's an inbuilt part of what it means to be human. And then, of course, the Islamic worldview would say, well, Allah is sovereignly in control of all things and all things come from him. So we just submit. That's what the word Islam means. It means to submit. So we submit to his will. We don't question it. But I would say when it comes to the Christian faith, in one sense, we aren't just to submit to suffering as if it's just a natural part of our world. In fact, in a sense, the Bible story says this isn't a natural part of our world. You look right back to the beginning of the Bible. It talks about how God creates a world that's good, a world without suffering, a world without disease, a world without death. And then it talks about how into that good world, God created people with a choice to live in that world God's way or to live in that world their own way. And the tragedy of human history is, of course, that people took that choice and they used it to reject God, to ruin his world and to ruin their relationships with God and with each other. Now, we might say, well, why did God give people a choice? I mean, why would God create a good world and then give people the possibility of messing it up? I think part of the answer is that God has given us choice because God is a God of love, and love and choice have to go together. If I'm to have a loving relationship with someone, I cannot force them to love me back. There has to be a willingness, a choice, a freedom on their part. And it's the same with God. If God is going to create a world where love is possible, there has to be the possibility that I could choose not to love God or not to love other people. But the tragedy is that often we have done that and we find ourselves in the mess that we're in. But also, I'd say that's not the end of the story, thankfully. Yes, the world we live in is not the way it once was. But if you fast forward right to the very final book of the Bible, we discover the world we live in is not the way it one day will be. And so the penultimate chapter of the final book of the Bible has this beautiful picture of this world being restored and transformed and suffering being taken away. And that's a beautiful vision of the future. Very different, actually, to many other religious systems, because Christian salvation is not about escaping this world to another dimension. It's about the transformation and the renewal of this creation that God created in the first place. And then right in the middle of the story, we see that there's a God who understands our suffering. So we see in Jesus, God himself coming into our broken, suffering world and experiencing himself the whole range of human suffering, exclusion. He lived as a refugee, misunderstanding, torture, injustice, ultimately crucifixion, probably the most horrific form of execution ever invented. If I am to believe the claim of the Bible that Jesus was not just a prophet or a teacher, but he was God himself, then I have to also believe that therefore God is not distant from my suffering, but he's a God who stepped into our suffering, has experienced it, has done something about it, and wants through his death and resurrection to make it possible for me to be in a world one day where suffering is going to be a thing of history. So we don't have all the answers, not exhaustive answers, certainly, but I would say there's a sufficient answer to make faith in Jesus reasonable and to give us a foundation that enables us to face the suffering of our worlds with a sense of hope and a sense of meaning in light of where we know things have come from, but also wonderfully where things are going in the future.